Welcome to the ENA University Conversation Series, where you can hear updates and highlights of everything happening within ENA University. Today's guest is ENA University Provost Patti Kunz, who will talk about the pathway programs, including the upcoming launch of the brand new Nursing Professional Development Pathway. Patti, welcome.
Thank you for having me today, Dan. I love to talk about ENA University.
And you're the perfect person too, especially when we're talking about the pathways, because of your forever interest in education and professional development and how that benefits nurses across the continuum of their career. Let's start by refreshing everybody a little bit about what the pathway programs are, what's in it currently, and really what the ultimate goal is for an emergency nurse who is interested in their career development and how the pathways can help them.
So I think if you want to start from the beginning, I think one of the most important ones to talk about, of course, is the Novice pathway, which is really designed for the nurse entering the emergency department. Gives them those basics and that foundational knowledge that they need to advance to a competent emergency nurse. It actually gives them about 22 continuing education hours and covers geriatrics and pediatrics and general assessment of patients in the emergency department and some other topics, of course, wellness and other things that are really important for the professional emergency nurse to be successful in their role. Obviously, that transcends into the competent pathway, which is for the emergency nurse that's been in the ED for a little while. And this pathway actually covers many additional topics. And one of my personal favorites, because I am also a fan of certification, is the fact that there is a CEN review available. This particular pathway has over 40 continuing education hours. And I think before I go any further, it's important for me to emphasize that emergency nurses are obviously nurses that are working around the clock. And that's one of the best features of anything in ENA University, and in particular the pathways, because they are available on your time, on your schedule, and when you want them. And so particularly for the competent nurse that probably is doing additional things at that point because they've been in the ED for a little while, that availability to have that information at their fingertips, I think, is really helpful. Obviously, one of my personal favorites is, of course, the leadership pathway. Having been in leadership for a little while, I find this to be an extremely valuable one. And in fact, two of the leaders in my department are currently doing the leadership pathway, one who is actually a new manager and one who would like to be a manager. And so they're both working on that pathway presently. And I think one of the things that's unique to emergency department leadership is that our world, of course, is different, and it's not just always that logical transition into leadership. You think that because you're a really good emergency nurse and you can be a really good charge nurse and you manage flow really well, that you can automatically transition. But there's many elements that we don't think about, like none of us really have a good background in finance and budgeting when we walk into the emergency department manager role. And so that's a benefit of this pathway, is that particular piece. There's also information about how to manage difficult situations, because honestly, while you might manage things peer-to-peer, when you're trying to mediate between peers or even having difficult conversations with staff, that's a skill that you don't just always come with, and that's also covered in this pathway. The leadership pathway has around a little over 6 CEUs, I believe, if my memory is correct. And it really does give you what you need to be an ED leader. There's throughput, there's other things that are specific to the emergency department environment that you wouldn't find in other areas of nursing management. And so the fact that we have this ED leadership pathway, I think, is a huge benefit to those that want to be managers, those who have recently taken a leadership job, or those who just feel like they could probably hone their own skills.
And that's a great point that I was going to jump in on there, is that the leadership pathway is for nurses who may aspire into leadership as well as those who are just getting into it, because it's got enough of those fundamentals that help a nurse understand all of those sort of, I won't call them secondary or ancillary, but all of those things that are not necessarily clinically driven that you would pick up on through the early stages of your career. And that's where I wanted to ask you next, before we get into the brand new pathway, is really the trajectory of a nurse's career is not necessarily linear, and the pathway programs help you to see what's possible across these different stages as you advance through your career. Why is it important for nurses to really have a good idea of what possibilities are out there, because it's not so linear?
I think it's really important that we all recognize that our roles do not always follow what you would think is a specific trajectory, because I never thought I would be a leader. I left leadership once to go back and get a PhD and never thought I would be in a leadership role again. So it just goes to show you 14 years later in a leadership role yet again, that you don't know how your career will go. I loved being a stretcher side nurse. I love patients to this day. Those are the days I'm happiest, when I can ignore a meeting and go help in the department. But the leadership pathway is particularly helpful because it also has a resiliency component, which I think is important, because your resiliency as a staff nurse and your resiliency as a leader are different. So I think that's another big selling point of this particular one. And that does really help when you think about what is that trajectory. Your trajectory doesn't really go forward unless you have that resilience.
So to recap for people, there's the novice pathway, there's the competent pathway, there's the ED nurse leadership pathway, and coming soon this fall is the nursing professional development pathway. What does that mean? What's in it? What are some of the highlights that you would want people to know about as it relates to this new pathway coming up?
Well, I already told you I was excited about the leadership pathway when it launched, and I'm almost as excited about the nursing professional development pathway, because that was my role for a number of years. And I do believe in lifelong learning and how very important it is. And again, being in staff development or nursing professional development is a different skill set, and it really is beneficial, of course, if you have that ED clinical experience, if you're in an ED professional development role. And the opportunity to have a professional development pathway that is geared toward the ED staff development or nursing professional development role is really beneficial, as it targets the things that we need to understand. So it helps with foundational knowledge around what other pathways are there and what new nurses need to know, but it also helps them develop content that is specific to the emergency department and helps them understand what's different about that content than what the inpatient nurse or the OR nurse or a nurse in another area of specialty practice might need. So I think the fact that this particular pathway is launching is going to be hugely beneficial. I have 3 nursing professional development staff in our department, and they're all really excited about this pathway. They can't wait until it launches because they think it will be really beneficial. And honestly, none of them are new in their role, and they're excited to see this pathway. So I think that really tells the story that, it's something done by emergency nurses for emergency nurses around a specific career focus that's going to help them in their own personal professional development grow in a role that they love.
And one other aspect of this that I saw as I'm reading through some of the notes was that this also is beneficial to the educators in the ED. How is it beneficial in your eyes as someone who really is a proponent of education and professional development? I mean, those two things really kind of link to each other in a lot of different ways, but this pathway having a little bit of a nod toward the educator. How is that so?
Well, I think that it's really important because just because you were a good nurse doesn't mean you're a good leader. Just because you're a good nurse doesn't mean that you can teach. And those educational concepts and those foundational teaching and learning principles that are shared in this pathway, I think, are very helpful because they give you the development skills that you need to be an effective nursing professional development member of your emergency department team. And so I think that's really probably one of the biggest differences about this pathway is it gives you something that you don't get in nursing school. It doesn't taught, we're not taught other than how to do a teach back with a patient. We don't learn principles of how you teach and educate, and that's covered here.
So the pathway, which will be out in the next couple of months, this fall, certainly, ENA social media and ENA email, all those things, we'll put that out into the world for our members and others to find out about. Right now, it's scheduled to have 10 courses, and they're still figuring out the contact hours. But certainly, Patti, as you've described, there's a lot of foundational knowledge that is really going to be beneficial in the long run for nurses across the continuum. Just kind of in the bigger picture here, ENA University is now approaching its 2nd year of existence, or it's been through 2 years, I should say, like an anniversary. These are the types of things that you, in part of the formation, the development of this, back in 2021, these are the types of things we expected to see. As you talk about this and you encounter members and even people who aren't members who are ED nurses, what's your message 2 years later about the things that university and the pathways are providing for the emergency nursing community?
I think one of the things that's important and sort of an analogy I would make for nurses to understand is we have used care pathways for patients for years because we know it's the most effective way to care for a patient that will give them the best outcome. These pathways are the most effective way for nurses to have good outcomes in their own professional careers and ultimately provide the best care to their patients, to those that they're teaching, to those that they're leading. It really puts them in the best position to live out that role that they've chosen, because the content, yet again, is developed by emergency nurses for emergency nurses with a special focus.
I can tell you one thing that hasn't changed in the 2 years since the launch of ENA University is the smile on your face when you get to talk about these things and your enthusiasm for it. And I know that you bring that out everywhere you get to talk about university, whether it's in your hospital, it's on the road, it's at ENA events. So ENA University Provost Patti Kunz, thank you so much for being a part of the conversation series today.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to share information about the pathways in ENA University. I really appreciate it.
And for anyone listening, the best place to find all the information about ENA University is by going to ena.org/ENAU, where you can find information about all the pathways, including the upcoming nursing professional development pathway, as well as all of ENA's education portfolio. So be sure to visit there and check out all of the information that's there. And while you're on the ENA University website, be sure to go to the Media Center, where you can find the conversation series that you're listening to right now, as well as ENA podcast episodes, ENA Connection articles, and other materials that have been talking to the people living and breathing some of what's going on at ENA University, from the residency program to the pathways and everything in between. You can find all that again by visiting ena.org/ENA University and just scrolling around to find what you're looking for. So for now, this is Dan Campana, the Director of Communications with the Emergency Nurses Association. Thanking you for being a part of the first ENA University Conversation Series episode.